Good morning and welcome to another episode of Unscripted and Unchained RPG Review. I am DM Bluddworth, and as you can see by the graphics, today's video is going to be quite a bit of a challenge here because I'm going to try to delve into the question of which tabletop RPG system handles NPCs the best. And when I talk about handling them, I'm talking about generating that social interaction pillar, and utilizing it and just getting the most out of the NPCs. And so I'm going to be comparing AD&D First Edition, Castles and Crusades, and D&D 5th Edition. So, as I said, it's going to be a real challenge to try to keep this as short and concise as possible. I don't want this to be a 3-hour long video. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to turn to each of the books and just talk about the key points of how each one handles the use of NPCs. The other thing I'm going to point out, and I don't mean this as a measurement of quality, but I will mention how much each of the Dungeon Master's guides, or in Castles and Crusades, the Keeper's Guide, how many pages they actually dedicate to discussion on the use of NPCs. Now, like I said, I don't want that to be a quantitative value that, well, if there's more pages, that means that it's better. And vice versa. I don't want it to, come off as saying, well, there's so few pages and so it's not a better system. So when I point out each of the systems and I go through them, I will read off the page numbers that I'm on because I'm not going to be displaying them as well because that would take too much time. Instead, I'm just going to be hitting those key points and describing how it's presented. And that's the real point, I think, in making these comparisons, is exactly how are the authors presenting NPCs in general, and how the mechanics come to play when utilizing them. So, without further ado, I am going to start off with AD&D First Edition, and this is the Dungeon Master's Guide. And so AD&D First Edition dedicates 11 pages total to NPCs, including hirelings and henchmen. So let me get right to it. And the first mention that it has is just describing what a non-player character is. So non-player characters, you should of course set the ability scores of those NPCs you will use as parts of the milieu, particularly those of high level and power. Scores of high level NPCs must be high. How else could these figures have risen so high? Determine the ability scores of other non-player characters as follows. General characters, and they just go into the attributes that you set. So right from the get-go, AD&D is focusing on just mechanics. All right, we will move on now to where they go into hirelings. So there are standard hirelings, and they talk about standard hirelings. So most hirelings are dealt with under the section entitled Expert Hirelings. Those who are typically employed at such time as the character in question has an established stronghold. Common standard hirelings are basically the usual craftsmen or laborers taken on by lower level players. Men-at-arms, soldiers, mercenaries, calling are dealt with under expert hirelings. So they do divide hirelings into different categories, and they discuss them they discuss them as a level indicators, like when you would kind of encounter them. And then they go through and they just explain what each type of hireling is, like a porter, a carpenter, a leather worker, and so on. When they get to expert hirelings, they talk about, some examples of what expert hirelings are and the costs. All right, so the monthly cost of the expert hirelings. Then they go into description of occupations and professions. So they describe what their jobs are so that well, what exactly does an alchemist do? What does an armorer do? What is the armorer's skill level? Again, getting into the actual mechanics of it. They continue on through, so now I'm on page 30. And they continue on with more and more descriptions of each of the expert hirelings. They have a separate section for sages. All right, so sages are a very special case indeed, for they are the encyclopedias, computers, expert opinions, and sort of demi-oracles of the milieu, all rolled into one. And so there's a variety of sage abilities, so sages actually get fleshed out a little bit more, but still on a very mechanical level. We then get to moving on through. They spend several pages actually on sages, so that's probably the bulk of what these 11 pages are. Is just talking about sages. So they do play a significant role. And the main reason for that is that they can actually be the sources of additional quests. Continuing on, we get into ship's crews, and again, specialty hirelings, and then we get into henchmen. And once you get into henchmen, now they talk about the level of the henchmen that you might attract, the racial breakdown of them, the skill levels of them, the possible classes of henchmen. Remember, henchmen oftentimes travel with a party on adventures. Sometimes they're a stand-in for a player character who's not available. And so they oftentimes have actual skill classes that they possess, and they go into payment once again. It gets into their loyalty and obedience and morale, and it goes through that whole section, and then a small section on what their alignment is. Nothing in AD&D talks about personalities or likes and dislikes or strengths and weaknesses. So it is all very mathematically driven. This is how much they cost. This is what skills they have. This is what it takes for them to remain loyal. And this is what it takes to break their morale. And that's basically it. So, Dungeon Master's Guide AD&D First Edition dedicates 11 pages. Most of the fleshing out is done with just the abilities and uses of sage, or sages, I should say, not the herb, but sages, and then just the monetary costs and abilities and such attributes for them there. Next, I'm going to take a look at Castles and Crusades. Now, I just spent the last 3 or so videos in my Castles and Crusades to actually break that whole section down. I'm not going to repeat all of that, obviously, but I am just going to point out some of the things that it does in a general sense. So NPCs in the Castle Keeper's Guide, and this is the latest edition, printing the 2021 printing. NPCs cover from pages 63 through 90, a total of 27 pages. Again, I'm not using the number of pages to represent quality. I'm just using them to demonstrate that there's a length of coverage that takes place on them. So let's see if that is well spent coverage. All right, so we go into NPCs, and there's a definition of NPCs. And it's a fairly lengthy definition of NPCs, talking about the different types of NPCs. So that alone takes roughly a page just explaining, or really a page and a half, just explaining the differences. It then talks about the power of clarity, all right, and how the castle keeper must be clear about the power balance between NPCs and their relation with the player characters. And they make a real focus to make sure that they don't cross that line where the NPC becomes the go-to person in the group, rather and outshine a PC character being controlled by a player. So that's another component that that Castles and Crusades really does focus on, and they spend about 2 pages just setting that up and talking about that. Then they get into, now they have 3 categories as well. They have adherents, they have hirelings, and they have henchmen. So adherents only have, what you focus on is their primary attributes. And so you don't need to know the other ones. You just need to know that they have a physical primary attribute, and that means that their skill checks are done for physical activities are done at a 12 instead of an 18. So you don't need to know what the other ability scores are. So you really only have to roll 2 or 3 potential ability scores for an adherent or a henchman, or or a hireling, just based on what their skill is mostly concerned with. They go through and they talk about the challenge rating of how easy it is or difficult it is to find these particular adherents or henchmen or hirelings in a given location. All right, now that's something that AD&D First Edition did not do. So far I've already found 2 fairly important things that Castles and Crusades is doing better than AD&D First Edition. They can then continue to go on, and they go through the definitions of each of the professions of these. So whether it's an archer bowman or a baker or a braider, roper. Not braider like hair braider, although I'm sure that would fall in here as well. But they just go through all of the descriptions, and there are several pages dedicated to that, because that's the other thing. There are so many. I mean, there's a full page. I think I counted it out once. There's like 53 different named NPC types, based on their skills and what they're actually bringing to the table in there. So it's a huge list beyond what AD&D First Edition had laid out for you. Now, that doesn't mean that in AD&D First Edition you couldn't add to the list, but they're right here. And so it kind of encourages you to utilize them instead of having to create them on your own. We then move forward to, the difference between Transient adherence and permanent adherence. So transients are ones that you might see once and utilize and have a conversation with once, and then you move on. You'll never see them again. And then there's the permanent adherence, where you're going into the town you grew up in. And so the mayor might be a permanent adherent, somebody you speak to often. The magistrate might be another. The stable master, or even the stable boy might be somebody that you're always talking to every time you're in your hometown, and then the tavern keeper or the constable or whatever. So those are going to be permanent adherents, individuals that the player character party speaks to often. They go into then hiring adherents and then just the charts and such of hiring them. They talk about special equipment that adherents might have. Again, another difference, an expansion from what AD&D First Edition had done. They actually talk about the backpack in Castles and Crusades. They call what are an equipment package that each class or each profession would typically carry, and so they talk about that here as well. Then they go into costs, which so far all of them do that. They get into henchmen, and they talk about henchmen. Now henchmen, again, same as in AD&D First Edition, henchmen tend to be classed characters, classed NPCs that travel with to fill in those gaps. Travel with the adventure party to fill in those gaps. It goes into their standard, how much they cost, how you have to treat them, and such. So they go into now a much more detailed listing of the terms and conditions of hiring these individuals. So they talk about starting fees and supplies and expenses and treasure sharing and goals and challenges and responsibility and compatibility with the group. So, and all of these have a modifier to how easy it is going to be to hire these individuals, to convince them to join your party. And then they get into henchman loyalty and what occurs if they fail their loyalty checks, as well as morale and reaction on top of that. Hirelings, so they go to hirelings next, and they talk about how to create a hireling, how to develop hirelings. All right, so it's not just, oh, you've hired them, they work for you, they cost you 3 gold pieces a month, and then you get, you might know their name, they don't necessarily need a name. And here they actually talk about, and they spend time on how to develop a hireling, how to locate them, how to actually hire them, and then retaining them. So retaining their loyalty, having them do morale checks. So some of that one component, loyalty and morale checks, is something that's going across both Dungeon Master's Guides. Cost and cost is another one that already both share. So they have some commonalities here. We then move on to let's see. They talk about creating creatures, and that's if you're having like a mount as a companion, more so than just a a mount, and with just a stat block for an animal. NPC backgrounds and personalities. So this is introduced here, does not exist in AD&D First Edition. So they talk about backgrounds and they talk about various things. So you're not just rolling the alignment or considering the alignment. You're looking at their background. What is their family background? Where are they coming from? What is their alignment? What is their personality? All right, how not to use NPCs is another thing that they spend almost 2 pages talking about how not to use NPCs. And I mentioned that earlier on, an NPC should never outshine a player character, should never be the go-to person in the character group in order to do something. And then they wrap it up basically, characters actually being hirelings, which is something that AD&D doesn't do either. It's basically the 0 level or very early first level adventurer that might be hired as a hireling, like a caravan guard or something very trivial in that sense. So that is the 27 pages of Castles and Crusades in the Castle Keeper's Guide. So now we're going to move on to D&D 5th edition. So D&D 5th edition dedicates 9 pages to NPCs, hirelings, henchmen, and so forth. So from pages 89 to 98. Again, I'm not making a statement of number of pages equaling quality. So when I go to this and I start seeing, it says designing NPCs. Nothing brings your adventures and campaigns to life better than a cast of well-developed NPCs. That said, NPCs in your game rarely need as much complexity as well-crafted character in a novel or movie. Most NPCs are bit players in the campaign, whereas adventurers are the stars. So they kind of make sure that NPCs do not outshine. So that's a common relation to Castles and Crusades. Quick NPCs. Now, these are the various things that you're going to roll to generate an NPC, and that's one departure from Castles and Crusades, is that here you're rolling a lot of these things to determine what the NPC's appearance is, their abilities. All right. So what's their high ability score? What's their low ability score? What are their talents? Their mannerisms, their interaction traits. So are they argumentative, arrogant, rude? Are they honest, hot-tempered, ponderous, and so on? Useful knowledge. So what useful knowledge might they have? What are their ideals? And you're rolling this. Bonds, you're rolling it. NPC flaws and secrets, you're rolling it. So a lot of these things are covering charts where you're randomly generating NPCs. And not much in the way of explaining or giving examples. That's one thing I didn't focus on Castles and Crusades, that they actually gave some examples of creating NPCs. And here they only took about like monsters as NPCs, and this is the only place where they mention an example. All right, where you're using a beholder as an NPC. And they just explain it, but not as the do's and don'ts or how to run it as an NPC. They're talking about just some of its knowledge that it might have as a beholder that the player characters might not have on their own. Nothing really stands out about the fact that it's a beholder, and there's going to be hang-ups over that interaction. So NPC statistics that they go into them. You have 3 main options: giving an NPC only a few stats, giving an NPC monster stat block, or giving it NPC class stats. All right. Using monster stat blocks, and they go in through how to use a monster stat block Using classes is pretty simple using classes. NPC party members, so how are they integrated? That goes back to henchmen, and that's dealt with in all of the other ones. Low-level followers, so this, even though there are low-level followers in the other two books as well, this 5e actually has a separate section for low-level followers. So your campaign might allow characters to take on low-level NPCs as followers. One advantage to low-level characters is to join. So they all have that. They all have, especially once you gain high level, particularly Castles and Keepers, more so than just AD&D First Edition. But they have a separate section here just talking specifically about low-level followers. It's not embedded in the overall explanations and charts in both Castle Keeper's Guide and in AD&D First Edition. Optional rule for loyalty. And then, so there's... Oh, we get into hirelings later on. So they have loyalty, tracking loyalty. No mention of morale separately as a main thing. And then they talk about creating arch-villains. And they spend about 1, 2, 3 pages. 3 pages on creating an arch-villain. All right, and they have 2 examples here. They have the a cleric of the death domain and a paladin that's an oathbreaker. All right, so they talk about the villain's schemes, the villain's methods, and so on. So there's a couple charts here for just villains' schemes and methods, and they go through. So you would roll a d8, and then within that d8, then you would roll a d4 within that. So basically, immortality. Acquire a legendary item to prolong life. Let's see, wealth, control natural resources or trade. I'm just looking at a couple of these schemes that they could have, and then the methods. For the first one, there's agricultural devastation, there's assault or beatings, there's bounty hunting and assassinations, there are confidence scams, there's defamation, there's dueling, there's execution, there's impersonating or disguising, there's lying or perjury, there's some of their methods, I would say are, they're kind of mundane. But for the most part, they do add in some of those more personality traits, more so than what AD&D First Edition had done. So, looking at the 3, if I had to say which one does it best, and this is as fair a comparison as I can do. I of course have a great love for this game and a bias for this game system. This is the game system that I grew up with and I played the most as a teenager. I still run a campaign today. My longest running campaign in recent years is still AD&D First Edition. But I don't run NPCs based on what this does or says. I run NPCs based on this. I've been finding that I'm bringing more and more from the standpoint of NPC and story development and such, campaign design and just ideas coming out of Castles and Crusades than AD&D First Edition, even though I run most of my campaigns using AD&D First Edition. 5e does some things better than AD&D First Edition, but not as well as the Castle Keeper's Guide for Castles and Crusades. I think that it's more in depth on certain aspects of it, but just for the creation of your arch villain. And even then, it's kind of really hyper focused on just two ideas, and the schemes and the methodology. I didn't find as being very very imaginative or just get you excited about those particular themes and and schemes. So if I had to put them in order, I would say the Castles and Crusades leads the way. AD&D D&D 5th edition does the personality and character building of NPCs better. And then finally, third would have to be AD&D First Edition. Has more details on how they function within the game. So on a much more mechanical level than 5e does. But I think that as a game master, I find more use in 5e than I do AD&D First Edition for just the NPCs utilization. But hands down, Castles and Crusades, I think, really puts the other ones, puts the other two, not to shame, but certainly it does everything that they do just a little bit better, and then it does some things that they don't do, and that's the bottom line. Now, is that coming from the fact that it is considerably longer? It's considerably longer because the authors spent more time explaining things and giving examples, and certainly spending more time telling you the do's and don'ts of how to use NPCs. And so that, for me, makes it stand out above the other two. So without going on it any longer, I really appreciate if you come in and you challenge my opinions. That's perfectly acceptable. If you want to come in and say, hey, take a look at this amongst the three systems, or take a look at a different system, and can you compare that to these three now? I mean, I could grab Pathfinder First Edition and see how they do. I'm not going to jump through and do AD&D Second Edition or D&D Third, Fourth. Even though I have them, I'm just comparing the oldest, most developed, and that's AD&D First Edition, to the most modern. Really is Castle Keeper's Guide, because that's printed in 2021, and then kind of in the middle would be 5e, being printed in 2014 or 2015. So, but anyway, it's a good span between AD&D, kind of like the start of real strong usage of NPCs, and I know D&D Beckme had it as well. I'm not making that statement, but I'm just comparing the advanced versions and then moving forward. So thanks a lot for joining. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed. Subscriptions have been increasing steadily. I'm always happy to see that number rise, because that means more people are coming in, and the more people that come in, it gives me the opportunity to present things to a wider audience, and then they can leave comments and ask me hey, take a look at this. Or they can come in and say, well, this is why I think that you're wrong, and this is what you should look at instead. Or, it's not just a numbers game, it's a reach game, and it's a game for me to learn more from you, especially through those comments. So I respond to those comments. I dig in even further, even deeper, and sometimes I invite, those that those that left a comment there, or asked about something in particular. I even invite them to, join me in a conversation, and then sometimes I even invite them on a channel for like my next live stream so that we can further discuss it. So, subscribing and hitting the alert button isn't just about the numbers. It's about the interaction, the social interaction between, myself and the my subscribers, and also my visitors. I mean, I love for visitors to come in. Most of the people that come to my channel are, visitors, and whether they just subscribe or not, their comments and questions and everything are also welcome. So please come on in, leave a comment, and also share. I often, forget to tell you, share these videos out so it gets even more broader exposure as well. So thanks for joining. Have a great day. Hopefully this one doesn't take 7 freaking hours to upload. Sometimes when I do these things in the morning or whatever, and my internet access decides that, well, uploading this half hour, 40-minute long video is going to take 7 hours to do it. So hopefully it goes faster. I don't know what the magic hour is during the day, when and that's a negative magic hour, is during the day when they decide I'm going to slow this crap down and make you spend half a day trying to upload it. So again, thanks for joining. Have a great day.